The Monday morning meeting had barely started when Stuart Mercer threw the report across the conference table. It landed with a slap that silenced the room. 9 people sat around that table, senior managers, account leads, 2 executives from the 3rd floor, and not one of them moved. Stuart stood at the head of the room, jacket buttoned, jaw set. The Halford Group's most celebrated regional director, promoted 3 times in 5 years, the kind of man who treated a conference room like a personal stage. This, he said, pressing one finger down onto the report, is the reason we lost Thornwick Financial. He paused. He let the silence stretch. Completely useless. Those 2 words fell slowly, designed to cut. And he was staring directly at me. Before I tell you what happened next, let me introduce myself. My name is Ava Sutton. I am a senior financial controls analyst at the Halford Group, 6 years in this building, precise, thorough, and someone who keeps records of everything. That Monday morning, I had no idea those 2 qualities were about to unravel this entire organization from the inside. The humiliation settled over me like cold water. I opened my mouth to explain what I knew about Thornwick and why that account had really collapsed. But I never got the chance. The conference room door swung open. 3 compliance officers stepped through and asked for Stuart Mercer by name. If you are new here, drop where you are watching from in the comments. Subscribe now, you genuinely do not want to miss what comes next. Stuart's expression shifted the moment those words left the lead officer's mouth. I watched it happen in real time, that controlled, polished confidence cracked. Just slightly. Just enough to notice, if you knew what to look for. He recovered quickly, the way people do when they have had plenty of practice doing exactly that. He straightened his jacket, tilted his chin up, and gestured casually in my direction. I think you may want to speak with my analyst, he said smoothly. She handled the Thornwick account. Any procedural issues would sit firmly with her. The lead officer, a composed woman in a dark gray blazer with a compliance badge on her lapel, did not glance at me. Neither did her colleagues. All 3 pairs of eyes stayed fixed on Stuart with an evenness that told me everything. Mr. Mercer, she said quietly, we need access to your laptop and your direct files. If you could unlock your system for us now, we would appreciate it. Stuart laughed. A short, brittle sound, nothing like his usual warm authority. Of course, he said. Not a problem. But I saw his hand as he reached for the laptop on the side table. His fingers were trembling. I filed that detail away, the way I always filed things. Because here is what 6 years inside financial controls teaches you, the most important information is rarely what people say. It is what their hands do when they think nobody is watching. I was always watching. The lead officer's name, I learnt later, was Blackwell. She worked with a quiet efficiency that I found almost calming inside a room full of held breath and nervous eyes. While her colleagues copied files from Stuart's system, she turned to me and asked a question that seemed perfectly ordinary on the surface. Miss Sutton, she said, in the course of your role, were you ever asked by a senior manager to process approval requests outside normal verification procedures? I felt the weight of the question immediately. Over the previous 11 months, Stuart had sent me late-night emails asking me to push through vendor authorizations ahead of the standard review cycle. He framed it always as urgency, a client deadline, a board commitment, something that could not wait. Each time, I had flagged my concerns in writing and processed them under direct instruction, which meant my objections were on record and so was his override. I had started to answer when Stuart's voice cut across the room. I think that falls well outside the scope of what Ava would know anything about, he said, stepping forward with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Officer Blackwell did not look at him, but I watched her right hand move, pen touching notepad, and she wrote something down. 3 or 4 words, perhaps. But in a room that quiet, everything is significant. The other executives were still seated. Still watching. Nobody was pretending to look elsewhere anymore. The file copying continued without another word. 2 days after that meeting, I discovered something that stopped me cold. The Thornwick financial account, the one Stuart had used to humiliate me in front of the entire conference room, had not failed naturally. Overnight, the client's entire transaction history had vanished from our internal system. Every record. Every signed approval. Every communication. Gone, as cleanly as if someone had drawn a cloth across a whiteboard. Stuart told leadership it was an IT error. A server migration gone wrong. He used very technical language and spoke with great confidence, and several senior managers nodded without asking a single follow-up question. But 3 weeks before that Monday meeting, something had felt wrong to me. I could not name it precisely at the time, just a low, persistent unease, the kind that makes you save copies of things you do not yet fully understand. So I had done exactly that. I archived the Thornwick reports to an encrypted personal drive and sent a summary to my personal email under the subject line, for reference. That evening, alone at my kitchen table with my laptop open, I went through every page. What I found was not an IT error. Millions of pounds had been moved through 3 vendor accounts that did not appear anywhere in the company's registered supplier list. The transfers were structured in irregular amounts, never round figures, never at predictable intervals, a pattern designed specifically to avoid triggering automatic alerts. I sat back in my chair and felt the full weight of what I was looking at. By Thursday of that same week, the entire office had changed around me. It started small. A colleague who usually greeted me in the corridor walked past without speaking. An email chain I had always been included on stopped arriving in my inbox. A morning briefing I had attended for 3 years was rescheduled without my being informed. By Friday, the rumors had taken a clear shape. Someone had decided the story was simple. Ava Sutton had triggered a compliance investigation through her own incompetence, and the whole department was paying for it. I heard it from a colleague named Bridget, who pulled me aside near the stairwell and said, quietly but not unkindly, that people were talking. Human Resources removed me from 2 active project teams without explanation. I received a single calendar decline and a 2-line message citing resource reallocation. Stuart walked the floor every morning looking entirely composed, greeting executives, laughing with account managers, performing normalcy so convincingly that for one brief and frightening afternoon, I began to doubt myself. Had I misread the vendor records? Had I constructed elaborate patterns from ordinary coincidences and built a story around them to protect my pride? Had I simply got it wrong? Then, at 5:05 on that Friday evening, my work phone buzzed. A message from an unknown compliance extension. Please do not delete, archive, or forward any communications received from Stuart Mercer. We will be in contact. The self-doubt evaporated immediately. They were building something. And they needed what I had. The car park beneath the Halford Group building was quiet by 7:30 that evening. I had stayed late trying to reconstruct a timeline of the vendor transfers, working through the archived documents I had saved. The lift took me to the lower level, and I was walking toward the exit when I heard his voice. Stuart was standing 2 rows of cars away, his back to me, phone pressed to his ear. He was speaking in a low, controlled tone I recognized, the voice he used when managing something he did not want managed publicly. I stopped moving. I was behind a broad concrete pillar, and in the flat fluorescent light of the car park, I was certain he had not seen me. She was not supposed to keep copies, he said. My breath caught. He was talking about me. There was no question. He was talking about me to someone who was apparently just as unsettled by my records as Stuart was. I know, he said, after a pause. I am handling it. He ended the call and stood still for a moment. Then, slowly, the way a person moves when something has shifted in the space around them, he turned toward the shadows where I was standing. I pressed myself flat against the concrete and did not breathe. The footsteps that followed were measured. Careful. Getting closer, then slowing, then stopping entirely. I had never been more aware of the sound of my own heartbeat. I do not know how long I stood behind that pillar. Long enough for the footsteps to slow, then stop. Long enough for a car engine starting somewhere nearby to break the stillness. Long enough to hear Stuart's footsteps finally retreat toward the executive lift. I waited 3 full minutes before I moved. The next morning, a meeting request was waiting for me. Sent at 6:47. From Stuart Mercer. Subject line, development discussion. I read it 4 times before walking to the glass-walled conference room where he was already seated at the head of the table, expression pleasantly composed. "Ava," he said warmly. "Thank you for coming. I wanted to talk about your future here." He offered me a promotion. Senior Operations Lead. A new title, a new contract, a new set of responsibilities. He spoke for 8 minutes about my potential, my value, and the company's commitment to its people. The words were fluent and carefully chosen, and they meant absolutely nothing. Because seated quietly at the back of the room, observing without speaking, were 2 compliance officers I had not noticed when I walked in. I had been so focused on Stuart that I had missed them entirely, and the fact that he had arranged this with them watching told me precisely what kind of offer this was. I looked at the contract on the table. The responsibilities section was broad and vague in exactly the way genuine promotions never are. It would have made me accountable for every financial approval processed during the past 18 months. I did not reach for the pen. I left that meeting without signing anything and without explanation. Stuart's composure slipped only slightly as I stood, a flicker of something tight behind his eyes that vanished almost before I caught it. I nodded politely and walked out. Behind me, I heard the quiet scrape of a compliance officer rising to her feet. 2 hours later, Officer Blackwell asked me to come to a temporary workspace on the 6th floor. She placed a folder of printed approval forms on the table, neatly ordered, each page on official company letterhead. "We would like you to review these," she said. "Take your time." I went through them slowly, approval after approval, each processed through my analyst credentials, authorizations for vendor payments totaling millions of pounds, all carrying my digital signature. I reached the 4th page and stopped. One approval was dated the 14th of February. I knew that date precisely because I had been on certified medical leave that entire week following a minor surgical procedure. I had not accessed the company's systems once. I had not been in the building. I had not opened a single work email. My signature was on that approval regardless. I looked up at Officer Blackwell and pointed to the date without speaking. Her expression changed, a small, controlled tightening around the eyes, and she wrote something in her notebook immediately. That expression told me this was exactly what she had expected to find, and that finding it mattered considerably. That afternoon, Stuart Mercer did not return from his lunch break. He was back the following morning, acting as though nothing had occurred. But the building felt different. I noticed it first in the lifts, clusters of employees going quiet when the doors opened, conversations that stopped rather than paused. By mid-morning, word had spread that the security camera footage covering the accounting wing had been wiped overnight. Every recording from the previous 48 hours. Gone without a trace. Information Technology issued a statement blaming a server error during routine backup. The explanation was brisk, corporate, and entirely unconvincing. I remembered something. 6 months earlier, Stuart had personally approved an IT upgrade focused specifically on the building's internal security systems. He had cited data protection compliance as the reason. The project involved contractors brought in from outside the company's usual supplier network and had taken 3 weeks to complete. At the time, it had seemed like thorough administration. Standing at my desk on a Thursday morning, it felt considerably less routine. Compliance did not respond to the footage loss with alarm. They responded with action. By noon, they were moving floor by floor through the building, locking access to certain servers and escorting information technology administrators from the data room with polite but absolute firmness. Employee security badges began failing on restricted entry points. Someone in the finance team told me quietly that he had overheard 2 compliance officers using the words federal involvement in the corridor outside the server room. That phrase changed the texture of everything around me. I kept my head down and kept working. On Friday afternoon, Patrick Gould found me. He was the Halford Group's chief financial officer, a tall, carefully dressed man who had been with the company for 14 years and who rarely spoke to anyone below director level without purpose. He appeared at my desk without warning and asked me, in a low voice, to follow him. We took the stairs to a small meeting room on the 2nd floor that I had never used before. He closed the door and did not sit down. "I am going to speak plainly," he said. "I want you to listen carefully." He told me to stop cooperating with compliance. He said it as a warning rather than an order. The distinction mattered to him, I could tell. He spoke about Stewart's relationships with senior figures inside the organization, about protection built carefully over the years, and about the professional fate of employees who had previously challenged people with that kind of positioning. "People who push against this," he said quietly, "do not survive it professionally." I listened without speaking. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small black flash drive on the table. He slid it toward me with 2 fingers, eyes steady on mine. "If they corner you," he said, "open this." He stood, straightened his jacket, and walked out without looking back. The door closed behind him with barely a sound. I sat alone at the table, staring at the drive. Then I picked it up and put it in my pocket. I did not open the drive until I was home that evening, sitting at my kitchen table with the curtains drawn. I plugged it into my personal laptop rather than any work device. That instinct felt right, and by this point I was trusting my instincts entirely. The drive contained a single folder with 7 audio files, each labeled with a date and a room number from the Halford Group building. I put in my headphones and pressed play. The first recording held Stewart's voice, unmistakable, that particular cadence I had heard in conference rooms for 6 years. He was speaking to at least 2 other people, telling them that compliance reporting for the 3rd quarter needed to be adjusted before submission. Not reviewed. Not reconsidered. Adjusted. He used that word 4 times in under 2 minutes. I worked through each recording in order. The 6th file stopped me entirely. Stewart was alone with 1 other person. The second voice was low and partially obscured, but his was clear. He was discussing which employees presented the least resistance, and then he said, without hesitation, "Sutton is quiet enough to take the fall. Nobody senior will push back on her." I heard my own name like a stone dropping into still water. I sat without moving for a very long time. The investigation was not about one corrupted account. This had been running for years. And I had been selected, deliberately, specifically, to absorb it when the moment came. The board meeting was called for Tuesday at 9 o'clock. I received no invitation. I found out from Bridget, who had heard from a deputy director, that it was a closed session concerning recent operational irregularities. I arrived early, sat in the open workspace outside the boardroom, and waited. Through the glass panels, I could see Stewart presenting at the main table. He was composed and fluent, the version of himself he deployed in high-stakes rooms, all measured confidence and precise language. I could not hear the words clearly, but I recognized the body language. He was constructing a narrative. I had seen him do it before. I watched 2 board members nod slowly. One non-executive director was writing notes. A long and terrifying minute passed during which the room appeared to be tilting entirely in Stewart's direction, and I felt the cold certainty that I had run out of time. Then Officer Blackwell entered from the far side of the room and connected a device to the main screen. The transaction timeline appeared. It was a long document, clean and methodical, dates, amounts, approval codes, account numbers. And beside each entry, in a column that could not have been clearer, were the authorizing names. Stewart Mercer's name appeared 11 times on the first page alone. The composure on his face did not collapse immediately. He stood very still, jaw tight, eyes moving across the document. Then it simply began, very gradually, to drain away, like sand through fingers that had finally stopped holding on. The room changed in a matter of seconds. I watched it through the glass, that particular stillness filling a space when people realize the story they were being told is not the story that is actually happening. Board members who had been leaning forward straightened back. The non-executive director who had been writing notes put her pen down. Stewart stood at the front of the room staring at the screen. His mouth was slightly open. He had not yet decided what expression to adopt. Then a senior executive seated to the right of the board chairman, a man named Jeffrey Bancroft, who had been with the Halford Group since its founding and whose name appeared alongside Stewart's on several governance documents, stood up quietly. He collected his jacket from the back of his chair, buttoned it with deliberate calm, said nothing to anyone, excused himself to no one, and walked to the far door. 2 compliance officers positioned near the side entrance moved immediately after him. The remaining board members watched in complete silence. I sat outside the glass and understood, in that moment, that this was not one person's corruption. Stewart had not been working alone, and he had not been protecting only himself. There were others inside this building who had participated, who had benefited, and who were now calculating whether the exit they had planned was still available. It was not. Stewart's confidence, that final performance of absolute certainty, began cracking from the surface downward. The following morning, Officer Blackwell asked to speak with me privately. She sat across from me in the 6th floor workspace and placed a printed summary on the table between us. "We want you to understand the full context," she said carefully. "There is something specific you should know about why you were targeted." She explained it simply and without unnecessary detail. 11 months earlier, I had been processing a routine batch of vendor payments when I noticed an anomaly, a transfer destined for an account I did not recognize, sitting just below the threshold that would trigger automatic senior review. I had flagged the discrepancy, placed a formal query on the approval, and followed the procedure exactly as written. The transfer had been held for 4 working days while my query sat in the system. 4 days in which whoever was expecting that payment had to wait, adapt, and revise their timing entirely. That transfer had been part of a sequence designed to move millions offshore before the end of the financial quarter. My attention to detail, a phrase Stewart had used about me disparagingly on at least 3 separate occasions, had disrupted that sequence, forced a scramble, and created a paper trail considerably harder to erase than anticipated. Stewart had spent the months that followed quietly building a case for my incompetence, so that when the truth surfaced, nobody in authority would trust my word over his. He had chosen entirely the wrong person to underestimate. On Wednesday morning, the building was locked down. I arrived at 7:50 to find that my security badge would not open the main entrance. The display panel blinked red and held. 3 other employees arrived behind me in the same 2 minutes and received the same response. We stood in the gray morning air looking at one another without speaking. A Halford Group security officer appeared from inside, spoke briefly into a radio, and told us calmly that access had been temporarily restricted by compliance authority and that further instructions would arrive by email. The emails came within the hour. Most departments were to work remotely until further notice. A small number of named individuals were to remain available for interview. I was on both lists. I had just settled at my home desk, documents spread open in front of me, when a message arrived via my compliance liaison contact, sent from Officer Blackwell's direct extension. And yet the message had not come from her. It was unsigned, sent from a department access number I did not recognize, and it contained 7 words, "You still have not found the final account." I read it twice. Then once more. Moments later, a news alert appeared on my phone. A senior Halford Group executive had been intercepted by compliance officers attempting to leave the building through a private rear stairwell that bypassed the main reception. The alert did not name the individual. It did not need to. I already knew exactly who it was. I spent that entire afternoon working through archived systems. I had access to the company's legacy data environment through a remote analyst portal that had not yet been restricted during the lockdown. Whether compliance had left it available deliberately or someone else had kept it open for reasons of their own, I was not certain. Either way, I used it. I searched through every vendor backup database I could access, cross-referencing supplier names, account codes, and approval chains against the records already saved to my encrypted drive. 3 hours in, I found it. It was disguised as a routine vendor backup file. The kind of entry that sits invisibly in a system for years precisely because it resembles everything around it. Inside, formatted as a supplier reconciliation ledger, was a complete record stretching back 9 years. Falsified consultancy payments. Contract values with no corresponding deliverables. Approved invoices for services that never existed. Millions of pounds, carefully distributed, carefully documented, and carefully buried. I went through the ledger column by column, working backwards through every approval chain. Most of the authorizing signatures were Stewart's. But not all of them. The oldest entries, from the earliest years of the scheme, before Stewart had even held his current position, carried a different authorization code entirely. One I had to trace back through the company's founding registration documents to identify. When I found the name attached to that code, I sat very still. I had been looking at the operator all along. Now I had found the architect. The name was Arthur Crane. He was listed in the company's founding documentation as a silent co-founder, typically meaning a financial backer with no operational presence. He did not appear in the staff directory. I had never heard his name spoken inside the building. He had no desk, no parking allocation, no visible footprint within the Halford Group's daily operations. And yet his authorization code sat at the origin of every significant fraudulent transaction in that ledger. I called Officer Blackwell immediately. She arrived at my home address within the hour, accompanied by a second officer I had not previously met. She sat at my kitchen table with a recording device running and went through every page of the ledger with me, line by line. At several points, she paused and stepped into the next room to make calls. Her voice through the wall was quiet and controlled, but I could hear the weight in it even at that distance. When she returned for the final time, she sat down and looked at me directly. "Miss Sutton," she said carefully, "what you have found goes significantly beyond the scope of an internal investigation. This matter is now being referred upward." I understood what upward meant. It meant beyond compliance, beyond the company, beyond anything that could be resolved with a governance report and a number of resigned directors. Stewart Mercer had not been running this scheme. He had been managing it on behalf of someone who had built it long before Stewart ever arrived. I had been expecting many things in the days that followed. I had not been expecting Stewart to find me alone. It was late on Thursday evening. I had been allowed back into the building briefly to collect documents compliance had cleared for my review. The floor was largely empty. I was packing files in the small conference room near the stairwell when the door opened. Stewart walked in and closed it behind him. He looked different from every version of himself I had encountered in 6 years. The jacket was still pressed, but the certainty had gone entirely. His face was the face of someone who had spent several days holding something very heavy and had finally decided to set it down. He sat across from me, hands flat on the table. "I need you to understand something," he said. What followed was unlike any conversation I had experienced in that building. He did not threaten me. He did not negotiate. He spoke with a flatness I recognized as the particular exhaustion that honesty sometimes produces. He told me he had constructed false cases against employees for years. That he had been given instructions and told it was simply how things worked at the level he had been invited into. "You were never supposed to survive this long," he said. "Not through this." He did not say it as a threat. He said it the way people speak when they acknowledge the full truth of their own failure. What he did not know was that I had pressed record before he sat down. The final board session took place the following Monday. I had not been invited to present. I had not been asked to attend at all. I attended anyway. I arrived to find the building's energy entirely changed, that particular quiet of institutions which have run out of internal momentum and are waiting for the conclusion of something they can no longer influence. The board convened at 9 o'clock. I walked in while the session was already underway and stood near the back beside Officer Blackwell. A number of executives were seated along one side of the table, looking as though they had prepared extensively for a conversation already decided elsewhere. 2 had legal representatives sitting quietly behind them. The chair of the board began outlining what she called procedural failures, language that carefully redistributed responsibility across the organization without attaching it to any specific individual. I let her finish. Then I took out my phone, connected it to the room's Bluetooth speaker system, and pressed play. Stewart's voice filled the boardroom at full, clear volume. He was talking about employees who were quiet enough to take the fall. He was talking about adjusted reports. He was talking about coverage from someone above him, someone whose name he used with the familiarity that revealed the full length of the arrangement. Nobody spoke during the recording. When it ended, the room was completely still. Officer Blackwell stepped forward. Her colleagues, positioned outside, came through the door one by one. Multiple people were escorted out. 6 weeks later, I stood outside the Halford Group building for the last time. The company was still standing, technically, legally, operationally. But the shape of it had changed entirely. 3 directors had resigned. 2 were under active investigation. Jeffrey Bancroft had not been seen since the board meeting. Arthur Crane's representatives had declined to comment on an ongoing matter. The compliance investigation had expanded into associated entities across 3 sectors. It had become, in the careful language of financial journalism, a matter of significant national interest. I had been offered a position. The board sent a formal letter proposing that I lead the company's newly constituted Governance and Controls Division. The compensation was considerable. The letter used phrases like invaluable integrity and rare professional courage. I read it twice. Then I set it aside. I stood on the pavement on a gray Wednesday morning, looking up at the glass facade that had framed 6 years of my professional life. I thought about the Monday Stewart threw that report across the table and what it felt like to hear the word useless spoken aloud in front of everyone, and I thought about what it truly means to remain somewhere that only discovers your worth after watching you survive. The answer was clear. I posted the letter back through the front door and walked away. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment. What would you have done in her place? Subscribe now if you have not already. Quiet and capable is never the same as useless.